The station floated in the dark like a silver needle stitched between two stars. It had no allegiance. It belonged to no one. That was the point. Aurelia Station was chosen because it was neutral ground, a place where no single species could claim an advantage, where the air recyclers hummed in 4 different atmospheric mixes, and where the corridors were wide enough for the tall, 4-armed Sorvani to walk without folding themselves in half. It was supposed to be a place of peace. Ambassador Serena Holt stood at the viewport of her quarters and looked out at the stars. She had been in space for 11 years. She had negotiated trade routes with the Keth Collective, signed medical exchange agreements with the Thalori, and once sat in a room for 6 hours with a Draven elder who communicated entirely through color changes in his skin. She was not easily shaken. But something about this place made her stomach tight. She turned away from the viewport and picked up her datapad. The pre-session briefing was already 300 pages long and still growing. Her team of 12 had been reading it in shifts. Most of it was legal language wrapped around legal language, the kind of writing designed not to explain things but to hide them. She had highlighted one paragraph. She kept coming back to it. The Terran Compact, hereafter referred to as the petitioning body, agrees to submit all requests, grievances, and proposals through the designated Council Liaison Office, which shall respond within a period not exceeding 1 standard galactic cycle. Petitioning body. Not allied nation, not partner civilization, not even member state, petitioning body. Like humanity was a group of farmers asking a landlord for permission to plant crops. She set the datapad down, breathed slowly, and walked to the door. It was time for the first session. The main hall of Aurelia Station was built to impress. The ceiling was high and domed, made of a material that shifted between transparent and opaque depending on the light. Right now it showed the stars outside, cold and distant, which Holt thought was either poetic or a threat, depending on who was doing the looking. 7 delegations were already seated when she arrived. The Sorvani sat at the head of the curved table, of course they did, with Vethkal at the center. He was tall even for his species, with pale silver skin and 3 sets of eyes arranged in a triangle on his long face. He wore deep blue robes that marked his rank as a high negotiator, a title that in Sorvani culture meant he had the authority of a small government. He had been doing this for over 200 years. He had negotiated the borders of 4 star systems and personally overseen the absorption of 2 smaller species into the Council's administrative structure. He looked at Holt the way a person looks at a stray animal that has wandered into a formal dinner. The other delegations were less openly hostile but not much warmer. The Keth Collective sent 3 representatives who were biologically identical and communicated in rapid clicks that their translation devices rendered into flat, emotionless speech. The Thalori sent a single elder Narration, who was small and gray, and so still she might have been carved from stone. The remaining delegations, the Dravani, the Pelori, the Ushan Reach, and the Collective of Minds, filled the other seats with varying levels of interest and boredom. Humanity's delegation sat at the far end of the table, 12 people, Holt at the front, all of them in plain dark uniforms with the blue and white crest of the United Earth Compact on their left shoulder. No robes, no ceremony, just people. Vethkal opened the session without a greeting. "We will begin with the structural terms," he said. "These are not subject to negotiation. They form the foundation upon which all further discussion will take place." One of Holt's team members, a young analyst named Darren, leaned slightly toward her and whispered, "Not subject to negotiation. At a negotiation." Holt did not respond. She opened her datapad and began reading as Vethkal spoke. The terms were read aloud by a Sorvani aide in a voice that carried no inflection, as if the words themselves were too important to be colored by tone. The hall was quiet. Some of the other delegations followed along on their own devices. A few did not bother. The first term was a fleet cap. Humanity was permitted to maintain a defense fleet of no more than 400 vessels. Any expansion beyond that number required written approval from the Council's Military Oversight Committee, which met twice per galactic cycle, roughly once every 14 Earth months. The second term was a colonization freeze. Humanity was to halt all new colony establishment for a period of 50 years, while the Council conducted what the document called a spatial impact assessment. The third term was a resource contribution framework. In exchange for Council protection and trade access, humanity would redirect 15% of its annual mineral and energy output to a central Council fund. The fourth term was the one that made the room feel smaller. All technological research developed by human scientists that fell within the categories of propulsion, weaponry, artificial intelligence, biological engineering, and energy manipulation was to be submitted to the Council's Bureau of Scientific Oversight within 30 days of development. The Bureau would then determine whether the technology was safe for humanity to use, deploy, or share. Holt read that last part twice. The Council would decide whether humanity was allowed to use its own discoveries. She looked up from her datapad. Vethkel was watching her with those 6 pale eyes, and there was something in his expression, not malice exactly, but something close to amusement. He had done this before. He knew how this felt to the people on the other side of the table. He had seen that look, the shock, the slow understanding, the swallowing of pride many times. He expected her to swallow it too. Around the table, the Keth representatives were already moving to the next section of the document. The Dravani delegate was speaking quietly to his aide. The Pelori had not looked up once. This was, to all of them, routine. A young species being fitted for its place in the order of things. Nothing unusual, nothing worth paying close attention to. Only Murashin, the Thalori elder, had not moved. She sat with her thin hands folded on the table and her dark eyes fixed somewhere between Vethkel and the human delegation, as if she were watching 2 things at once. Holt set her datapad flat on the table. She did not speak yet. She listened to the rest of the terms being read. There were 11 more. Each one was framed in careful, polite language. Each one was a smaller cage than the one before it, and together they built something complete. By the time the aide finished reading, the room was very quiet. Vethkel folded his hands. The Council will allow time for the petitioning body to review the terms. We will reconvene tomorrow to begin formal acceptance proceedings. Acceptance proceeding, not response, not discussion, acceptance. Darren wrote 2 words on a paper notepad, something humans still used when they did not want their words recorded by station systems, and slid it across the table to Holt. She looked down at it. They're serious. She turned the paper over, wrote 3 words and slid it back. I know, good. Darren looked at her. She was already closing her datapad, her face calm, her posture straight. Whatever she was thinking, it did not show. That was something she had learned early. The most important thing you could do in a room full of people who expected you to be afraid was to simply not be afraid, or at least not to look it. She stood. We will review the terms this evening, she said. Her voice was even. Thank you for your time. Vethkel nodded, as if he had expected nothing less. The human delegation filed out in a quiet, orderly line. The doors closed behind them. In the corridor outside, nobody spoke until they had turned 2 corners and were well away from any station sensors they had not already accounted for. Then Darren exhaled slowly. 15% of our resource output, a 50-year colonization freeze. They want to approve our own technology before we can use it. Yes, Holt said. What are we going to do? She walked a few more steps before answering. The corridor lights hummed softly above them. Somewhere deeper in the station, the atmospheric recyclers shifted, and the air changed very slightly, a mix of something floral that belonged to the Thalori atmospheric preference. "We're going to read every word of that document tonight," she said. "Every word. And tomorrow we are going to walk back into that room." She did not say what would happen after that. She did not need to. The 12 people walking behind her had been chosen carefully. They were not diplomats who smiled and bent. They were people who understood what was being asked of them and what it meant to say no. Outside the viewport at the end of the corridor, the stars were still cold and distant. But they had always been there, waiting, and humanity had always found a way to reach them. Tomorrow would be interesting. The chair pushed back. The second day began the same way the first had ended, with the Sorvani at the head of the table, and the rest of the galaxy arranged around them like furniture. Vethkal arrived early, which was unusual. He sat in his chair with his robes arranged and his 6 eyes bright, and he watched the other delegations take their seats with the calm patience of someone who had already decided how the day would go. His aide had prepared a schedule. First, the human delegation would raise their questions. There were always questions. There were always concerns, and he would answer them with the practiced patience of a teacher correcting a child's arithmetic. Then by midday, the petitioning body would sign the structural terms. By evening, Vethkal planned to send a message home. "It is done." He had done this 4 times before. Once with the Pelari, who had cried literally, in the chemical way their species expressed grief and signed anyway. Once with a species called the Venu, who no longer existed as an independent civilization and were now a protected administrative zone under Sorvani management. He had never enjoyed it exactly, but he understood it. The galaxy had an order. That order had kept peace for 3,000 years. Young species needed to be guided into it. That was not cruelty, that was structure. The human delegation entered at exactly the scheduled time. 12 people, same plain uniforms, same quiet walk. Ambassador Holt sat at the end of the table. She put nothing on the table in front of her. No datapad, no notes, no water glass, just her hands folded loosely and her eyes, which were dark brown and very steady. Vethkal nodded at her. She nodded back. "We will begin," he said. He had expected her to speak first. That was how it always went. The junior party asked their questions, showed their concern, demonstrated their discomfort with the terms, and then accepted them because the alternative was worse. It was a ritual. It had a shape. Holt did not ask a question. "Before we begin," she said, "I want to make sure I understood the terms correctly, specifically the 4th structural term." "Of course," Vethkal said. "The term states that any technology we develop in the listed categories must be submitted to the Bureau of Scientific Oversight within 30 days. The Bureau will then determine whether we are permitted to use it." "That is correct. There is no time limit on how long the Bureau takes to make that determination." Vethkal paused for just a moment. The Bureau operates on standard council timelines, which are not defined in the document. They are consistent with established council practice. Holt nodded slowly, and council practice is defined by the council. "Naturally. So in practice," she said, "we could develop a technology, submit it, and wait indefinitely for permission to use something we created." "The Bureau is efficient," Vethkal said. There was a slight edge in his voice now, the first one. "This concern is theoretical." "Most bad agreements feel theoretical until they are not," Holt said. The room was quiet for a moment. One of the Keth representatives made a soft clicking sound. The Dravani delegate looked up from his device for the first time. Vethkal leaned forward slightly. "Ambassador Holt, I understand that these terms may feel uncomfortable. That is natural. Every species that has joined the protective framework of the Galactic Council has had similar concerns. I assure you that in practice, the framework functions well. The species currently operating under it are stable, safe, and prosperous." "They are also not growing," Holt said. "The Pelori have not expanded their territory in 80 years. The Ushan Reach has submitted 43 technology applications to the Bureau in the last decade. 12 have been approved. 9 are still pending. That is not prosperity. That is management. The Ushan delegate, a quiet being with long green fingers and a reputation for never speaking during formal sessions, looked up sharply. Vethkel's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes did. The petitioning body is here to negotiate its own terms, not to speak on behalf of other council members. I am simply using the available data, Holt said. Then let us return to the matter at hand. His voice had settled into something cooler now, more deliberate. The structural terms have been prepared carefully and in good faith. They represent the Council's best assessment of a responsible integration path for a species at humanity's current developmental stage. They are not personal, they are procedural. There it was. Holt had been waiting for that word, developmental stage. She had read it in 3 different Council documents over the past week. It was the polite way to say you are children and we are deciding what is best for you. She let the silence sit for a moment. Then she looked down at her hands, unfolded them, and placed them flat on the table. When she looked back up, she did not look at Vethkel. She looked at every face in the room, one at a time, slowly. The Keth, the Dravani, the Pelori, the Ushan delegate who had looked up and had not looked back down, and lastly Narration, the Thalori elder who was watching her with those still dark eyes. Then she stood up. It was a small movement. She simply rose from her chair, but in the context of a formal council session where seated negotiation was centuries of protocol, it was noticed immediately. Every delegate in the room shifted. Vethkel straightened. "Ambassador," he said with a note of warning. "I want to say something," Holt said, "not as a formal position, as something I need this room to hear." She did not wait for permission. Humanity has been alive as a spacefaring civilization for less than 200 years. Before that, we were alive as a species for roughly 300,000. In that time, we were nearly wiped out by ice. We were nearly wiped out by disease. We destroyed large portions of our own planet and then rebuilt it. We went to war with ourselves so many times that we lost count, and we survived every time. And we learned something every time, even when the lesson cost us more than we thought we could afford to pay. The room was very still. "We are not asking you to be impressed by that," she continued. "We are not asking for special treatment because of it. We are simply asking you to understand what it means. It means that we did not come all this way, across the dark, across the cold, to a station floating between someone else's stars, to sit at a table where we are called a petitioning body and told that we may not use our own discoveries without your approval." Vethkel opened his mouth. She continued before he could speak. "We came here in good faith. We came here ready to talk. We came here ready to build something with you, not under you, not inside a structure you designed to keep us small and manageable. With you, as equals. That is the only kind of agreement humanity is going to sign." The room was perfectly silent. Even the atmospheric recyclers seemed to pause. Holt reached down to the table, picked up the printed copy of the structural terms that had been left at her seat, and set it back down flat. "The United Earth Compact is withdrawing from these talks," she said, "effective now." Then she looked at Vethkel one more time. He was staring at her. All 6 eyes were open wide, which in Sorvani physiology was a sign of strong emotion. He had not moved. He looked, for the first time in perhaps a very long time, like a person who had not expected what just happened. "When the Council is ready to sit at a table where no one is a petitioner," she said quietly, "you know how to find us." She pushed her chair in neatly, the way someone does when they are leaving a place they respect even if they are angry with it, and she walked toward the door. Her 12 followed her, one by one, in the same calm and quiet line they had entered. The door opened, she walked through, they walked through, the door closed. In the hall, there was a long moment of complete silence. Then Vethkel turned to his aide and said, in Sorvani, something that did not translate well, but the closest approximation was, That did not go as planned. At the far end of the curved table, the Ushan delegate had folded his long green fingers together and was looking at the closed door with an expression that was hard to read but impossible to ignore. And Narration, who had not moved, who had not spoken, who had barely seemed to breathe through the entire session, slowly allowed herself the smallest possible smile. It was gone before anyone noticed, but it had been there, the silence that roared. For the first 3 days after the human delegation left Aurelia Station, Vethkel was not worried. This was, he told his staff, a predictable reaction. Young species sometimes pushed back. Sometimes they made dramatic exits. It was emotional. It was understandable. It would pass. Within a week, perhaps 2, the United Earth Compact would send a quiet message through one of the minor diplomatic channels asking to resume talks. He had seen it before. Pride was always temporary when the alternative was standing alone in a galaxy that had 7 very old and very powerful civilizations looking in your direction. He drafted a response in advance, gracious, understanding. The council would welcome them back. No need to make it more difficult than it had to be. He waited. The message did not come. By the end of the second week, his senior aide, a cautious Sorvani named Pell, had started leaving reports on his desk in the morning rather than briefing him in person. That was how Pell handled information he did not want to deliver out loud. Vethkel had learned to dread those reports. He picked one up on the 15th morning and read it standing at his desk. He read it again sitting down. Then he sent for Pell. The intelligence had not come from a single source. It had come from 6 different monitoring systems, 3 of which were officially watching human space for the exact purpose of catching anything unusual. The analysts had cross-referenced the reports twice before sending them up the chain, because the first time they saw the numbers, they thought there was an error. There was no error. Humanity's publicly registered fleet, the fleet that every council species had records of, the fleet that the structural terms had been designed to cap at 400 vessels, was indeed 400 ships, well-maintained, properly cataloged, and right where they were supposed to be. But the public fleet was not the whole fleet. Deep in the asteroid fields of 3 different human star systems, inside the hollowed-out cores of rocks that officially held mining equipment, and not much else, construction had been ongoing for 11 years. The stations were dark by design, no emissions that would be flagged by long-range sensors, no communication patterns that would stand out, no schedule that matched any official Earth naval record. The workers who built these ships had signed agreements so airtight that Council Intelligence Services had not found a single leak in over a decade. The hidden fleet numbered over 1,000 vessels. Several classes had never been seen before by any council species. Their drive signatures, when analysts finally compared them to known human propulsion research, didn't match. They matched something newer, something the council had never received a report on, because the Bureau of Scientific Oversight had never approved it, because humanity had never submitted it. They had been building ships no one knew existed, using engines no one knew they had. Vethkel set the report down very carefully. "There is more," Pell said quietly. There was always more. The second report was about communications, specifically about a council encryption protocol called Deep Lattice, which had been in use for 40 years and was considered unbreakable by any species operating below a certain technological threshold. The Council had rated humanity as well below that threshold as recently as 18 months ago. At some point in the previous 14 months, a human artificial intelligence system had quietly and completely solved Deep Lattice, not cracked it partially, not found a single vulnerability. Solved it, meaning that for an unknown period of time, every encrypted council communication had been readable by human intelligence services. The peace talks, the pre-session briefings, The private channel conversations between Vethkal and the Council's strategic committee, the actual internal positions, the real flexibility ranges, the things that were never meant to be said in the negotiating room. Humanity had known all of it. Ambassador Holt had sat across the table from him for 2 days knowing exactly what his real positions were, knowing exactly how far the Council would actually go, knowing that the structural terms had been designed with significant hidden flexibility, that the Council intended to reveal slowly as a gesture of goodwill to make humanity feel heard. She had known there was no goodwill in it. She had known it was theater. And she had walked out anyway. Vethkal stood at his window for a long time after Pell finished briefing him. He was not a man who frightened easily. He had lived through things that would end most beings, but he felt something now that he had not felt in a very long time. Not quite fear. Something adjacent to it, the sensation of standing on ground that had felt solid and discovering it was not. The third report was, in some ways, the most quiet and the most significant. 3 species on the outer edge of Council-administered space, the Ushan Reach, a small mineral-rich civilization called the Farron, and a scattered species known as the Leo who had never fully committed to Council membership, had in the past 6 months signed bilateral agreements with Earth, trade agreements, defense agreements, mutual assistance frameworks, the kind of paperwork that on its surface was not alarming. Species signed agreements with each other all the time. But the Ushan Reach had 43 technology applications pending with the Bureau of Scientific Oversight. The Farron had been waiting 11 years for a colonization approval. The Leo had never had a treaty with anyone. Now all 3 of them had one with humanity. And the agreements included a clause, simple, clear, 1 paragraph long, that said any signatory under external pressure could request support from the others. It was, in legal terms, a mutual defense pact. It was, in practical terms, a message. Humanity was not standing alone. There is one more thing, Pell said. He had not sat down during the entire briefing. He stood near the door with his hands folded, which was the Sorvani posture for I wish I did not have to say this. Of course there is, Vethkal said. Construction has been confirmed at a location in the Verath corridor, a station, deep space class, estimated completion within 9 months. Pell paused. The Verath corridor is the primary hyperlane connecting our Eastern military logistics network. Vethkal turned from the window. The Verath corridor was not in human space. It was not claimed by any species. It was simply a lane of travel that the Council had used for so long it had stopped thinking about it as a strategic asset and started thinking about it as a road. Roads did not need to be defended. Roads simply existed. Except that a station in the Verath corridor, positioned correctly, could monitor everything moving through it. Could, in a conflict, slow or stop that movement. It was not a weapon. It was something more precise than a weapon. It was a key in a lock that the Council had forgotten it had. And humanity had found the lock. Vethkal turned back to the window. Outside, the stars were the same as they always were, cold and distant and numerous and indifferent. Send the reports to the full Council, he said. Emergency session, as soon as possible. Pell nodded and left without another word. Vethkal stood alone in his office. He thought about Ambassador Holt, the way she had folded her hands on the table, the way she had stood up, the quiet and total lack of anger in her voice when she had said you know how to find us. He had read it as pride at the time. Young species pride, emotional, temporary. He understood now that it had not been pride. It had been patience. It had been the voice of someone who had already counted their cards and knew the number was enough. The Keth Collective's lead delegate, when he received the reports, sent a single line of text to the Council emergency channel before the session even convened. They were not unprepared, they were waiting. It was the most the Keth had ever said with so few words. And in her private quarters on Thalori Prime, Narration read the same reports and folded them neatly and sat with her eyes closed for a long time. She was very old. She had watched many species rise and fall and be folded into the Council's long history like pages in a book that was still being written. She had not seen one do this before, not like this, not this quietly. She opened her eyes. "Remarkable," she said to the empty room. Then she began composing a message to the Council. She had things to say that the others were not going to want to hear. That, she had decided, was exactly why she needed to say them. The reckoning. The Council's emergency session was held on Sorvani Prime, in a chamber that had not hosted an emergency session in 63 years. The room was old. The walls were made of dark stone quarried from a mountain that no longer existed, and the table in the center was a single piece of the same stone, smooth and heavy and cold to the touch. It had been built to last. Everything on Sorvani Prime had been built to last. The Sorvani believed deeply in permanence, in structures that would outlive the people who built them, in traditions that carried their weight forward through time without bending. That belief had served them well for 3 millennia. Right now, in this room, with the reports spread across the stone table and 7 of the most powerful beings in the known galaxy sitting in various states of unease, it felt less like a strength and more like a habit that had outlasted its usefulness. Vethkel opened the session. He was more measured than usual, not because he was calm, but because he understood that this was not a moment for his usual confidence. He summarized the intelligence reports clearly and without embellishment. The hidden fleet, the solved encryption, the 3 outer fringe species now aligned with Earth, the station under construction in the Verath corridor. He did not tell the room what to think about it. He let the facts speak. There was a long silence when he finished. Then the Sorvani High General, a broad and heavily built woman named HFY, put both hands on the table and leaned forward. "We move on the Verath construction site. Now, before the station is complete, we site unauthorized construction in a protected navigational zone and we dismantle it." "That is an act of war," said one of the Keth representatives. "That is enforcement of existing law," HFY said. "With what justification?" the Keth replied. "The Verath corridor is unclaimed space. There is no existing law that prohibits construction there. We simply never imagined anyone would do it." "Then we make a law." "We cannot make a law retroactively to punish an action that was already taken. That is not how law works." "With respect," HFY said, "without any respect at all. When we are talking about a structure positioned directly across our primary Eastern logistics route, I am less concerned with legal elegance and more concerned with the fact that humanity just quietly put a hand around our throat and is waiting to see if we notice." "They noticed we would notice," Pell said from the side of the room. He was not a delegate but had been permitted to attend as a technical advisor. Everyone looked at him. He continued, unfolding his hands. "The placement is deliberate. They are not hiding it. They filed a construction notice, a real one, through the proper channels, just as any species is permitted to do in unclaimed space. They followed every rule. They want us to see it." "Why?" the Dravani delegate asked. "Because it is not a threat," Narration said. Her voice was quiet, but it reached every corner of the room the way quiet voices sometimes do when everyone else stops talking to listen to them. She had not spoken until now. She was the oldest person in the room by at least 100 years, and she had a way of waiting that made her words, when they came, feel like they had been worth the wait. "It is a demonstration," she continued. "There is a difference. A threat says, 'Do what I want or I will hurt you.' A demonstration says, 'Look at what I can do. Look at what I have already done. Now consider whether you would like to have a real conversation.'" HFY stared at her. "That is a comfortable interpretation." "It is an accurate one. If humanity intended to threaten us, they would not have been so careful to stay within the law. They want us to see that they can match us. They are not asking us to be afraid of them. They are asking us to take them seriously." Narration looked around the table slowly. which is all they ever asked. The room was quiet again. Then Narration did something she had not done in any session in living memory. She stood up. She was small standing, barely visible above the stone table, but the room felt her presence in a way that had nothing to do with size. "I have been in this council for 91 years, she said. "I have watched us manage 11 species, guide them, support them, keep order, and we have been good at it mostly. I do not say what I am about to say to attack anyone in this room. I say it because I believe if we do not hear it now, we will regret not having heard it for a very long time." She pulled a thin data chip from her robe and set it on the table. "Before these talks, I requested a full historical file on the human species from the Thalori archives, not the Council's summary file. The full record, cross-referenced with our own historical data from early observation." She pressed the chip into the table's reader, and a display rose above the center of the table, numbers, graphs, a long timeline marked with events. 6 near-extinction events, she said. In 300,000 years, ice ages that covered most of their planet, a series of plagues that killed nearly half their population in under a century, a period of industrialization that damaged their atmosphere so severely that several of our early analysts predicted they would not survive it, 2 global conflicts that killed tens of millions of their own people in under a decade each. She let that sit. "After each of these events," she continued, "they did not stay at the level they were before the disaster. They rebuilt, and when they rebuilt, they always went further. They solved the Ice Age problem by developing fire and then agriculture. They solved the plague problem by developing medicine and then microbiology. They solved the atmospheric problem by developing renewable energy faster than any species our archives have on record. They solved the war problem, imperfectly, yes, and not without cost, by eventually building a unified planetary government that has held for over 150 years." She turned off the display. "There is a pattern here. This species responds to being told it cannot survive by surviving. It responds to being told it cannot do something by doing it. We walked into those talks and we looked at 200 years of spaceflight and we thought, young species, beginning stage needs management. But we were counting from the wrong starting point. We should have been counting from 300,000 years ago." She looked at Vethkel directly. "We did not offer them a framework for growth. We offered them a ceiling, and they looked at the ceiling and decided they did not want to live in that house." Vethkel was very still. His 6 eyes were fixed on the stone surface of the table. "What are you proposing?" Ashavel asked. Her voice had lost some of its edge. "I am proposing that we stop treating this as a problem to manage and start treating it as an opportunity we almost wasted. Humanity does not want to fight us. The evidence of that is in this very room. If they wanted a fight, we would already be having one. They have the fleet for it. They have the intelligence capability for it. They chose instead to walk out of a bad agreement and wait. That is not the behavior of an enemy. That is the behavior of a partner who was insulted and is waiting to see if we are capable of doing better." The Ushan delegate, who had said almost nothing the entire session, cleared his throat gently. Everyone looked at him. He spoke rarely enough that when he did, it mattered. "My civilization has 43 applications pending at the Bureau," he said. 12 approved in 10 years. 3 of the pending ones are for medical technologies. People have died waiting for those approvals." He folded his long green fingers on the table. "I signed the agreement with Earth because they did not ask me to submit anything for review. They simply asked if I wanted to be treated as an equal." He paused. It was not a difficult decision. The room absorbed that. Narration sat back down. "We have a choice," she said. "We can treat Ambassador Holt's departure as a crisis to be controlled, or we can treat it as a message that finally reached us. I know which choice I am going to argue for." She looked around the table one last time. "I hope I do not have to argue alone." The vote for a new diplomatic approach was not unanimous. Ashavel abstained. One of the Keth representatives voted against. But the motion passed, and for the first time in the Council's long and settled history, it was agreed that the terms for a new meeting would be drawn up not by the Council's legal team, but by a joint committee including, if she was willing, input from Ambassador Holt's office. Vethkel left the chamber last. He stood in the doorway for a moment and looked back at the old stone table, smooth and dark and built to last. He thought about what Narration had said, about counting from the wrong starting point. He had always thought of humanity as a species 200 years old. But if you counted from the beginning, from the ice and the plague and the wars and the long climb up from a planet they had nearly destroyed and rebuilt with their own hands, they were something else entirely. They were 300,000 years of refusal to give up, shaped into people who wore plain dark uniforms and folded their hands on tables and waited. He walked out. There was a great deal of work to do, a new table. The message arrived at Earth's Deep Space Relay Station on a Tuesday morning, Earth Standard Time. It was addressed to Ambassador Serena Holt personally, routed through the official Council diplomatic frequency, and marked with a header that the relay's translation system flagged as unusual, not because the language was difficult, but because the specific phrase used in the header had never appeared in a Council communication before. It said in clean and simple terms, a request for conversation if you are willing. Not a summons, not a reinstatement of previous terms, not even a formal offer, a request, the smallest possible word for the thing they needed. Holt read it at her desk on the UECS Endurance, which had been her home and her office for the past 6 weeks since Aurelia Station. She read it twice. Then she set her datapad down and looked at the wall for a moment, which was what she did when she was thinking and did not want anyone to see her face while she did it. Darren knocked and came in without waiting, which was something she had told him to do. "It's real," he said before she could ask. "Signal authentication checks out. Council origin, high-level authorization, no additional terms attached." He paused. "No preconditions." She nodded slowly. "What do you want to do?" he asked. She picked up the datapad again and read the message a third time. It was short. The Council was prepared to begin new discussions. They proposed a location, not Aurelia Station, which carried the weight of what had happened there, but a different place, a smaller station in neutral space near the Thalori border. They proposed a format, each delegation equal in seating, equal in speaking time, no prepared terms to be presented at the opening session. They proposed that the first meeting be a conversation and nothing more. They did not apologize. She had not expected them to. Species that had spent 3,000 years at the top of a structure did not apologize easily. But the message itself was a kind of apology in shape, if not in words. The form of it said more than the content. "Tell them yes," Holt said. "Tell them we'll be there." Darren nodded and left. Holt stood up, walked to the viewport and looked out at the stars. They were the same stars they had always been, the same ones she had looked at from Aurelia Station, from Earth's orbit, from every ship she had ever served on. They did not care about politics. They burned the same regardless. But they were, she thought, a little warmer than they had been 6 weeks ago. The new station was called Verada Nil, which translated from Thalori as something like the place between places. It was small and functional and deliberately plain. None of Aurelia Station's domed ceilings and design grandeur. It had one main meeting room, a ring of smaller consultation rooms, and a common area with atmospheric mixing that blended every delegation's preferred air composition into something that was uncomfortable for everyone equally, which Holt thought was an honest way to start. She arrived first. That was also a choice. She wanted to be in the room when the others entered, not the other way around. The room was arranged differently from Aurelia's. There was no head of table. The table was round, actually round, not the curved shape that Aurelius had used, which technically still had a front and a back. This one was a perfect circle, and the chairs were identical, and the name plaques at each seat were the same size and the same font. Holt ran her finger along the edge of the table when she first walked in and found it smooth all the way around, no seam at the join, made from a single piece of material. Somebody had thought carefully about that. She sat down and waited. The delegations arrived over the following hour. The Keth, the Dravani, the Pelori, who sat down with a quiet formality that held something careful and watchful inside it. The Ushan delegate, who nodded at Holt when he sat. The representatives of the Farron and the Leo, who were attending a full council session for the first time, both of them looking around the room with the same expression, a mix of uncertainty and something that was working hard to become confidence. Narration arrived with the Thalori delegation and sat directly across the circle from Holt. Their eyes met briefly. Narration gave the smallest possible nod. Vethkel came in last. He looked the same as he always had, tall, silver-skinned, perfectly composed. But there was something different in the way he moved into the room. He did not go to the head of a table because there was no head. He found his seat in the circle and sat down. And there was a moment when he looked at the round table and the identical chairs. And something passed across his face that Holt could not quite name but recognized as a man, adjusting to a world that had moved slightly since the last time he checked. "Thank you all for coming," he said. It was the first time in Holt's experience that he had thanked anyone for anything. The first session lasted 4 hours. No terms were presented. No documents were signed. There were arguments, real ones, about what a fair framework would look like, about the Bureau of Scientific Oversight and whether it could be reformed or needed to be replaced, about what the fringe species were owed and how long they had been waiting. The Sorvani pushed back on several points. The Keth were difficult about the fleet transparency requirements. Holt's team pushed hard on the technology approval timelines and harder on the colonization freeze. And there were 2 moments when voices rose, and the translation system struggled to keep up. It was not comfortable, it was not graceful, it was the work. What it was not was a room where one species presented terms to another and called it diplomacy. Over the following 3 weeks, the sessions continued. Some days were better than others. There was one afternoon where the Dravani delegate walked out, not dramatically, not as a statement, but simply because he disagreed with the direction of a particular discussion and needed an hour. He came back. They kept working. Holt slept 4 or 5 hours a night during those weeks and ate most of her meals at the desk in her consultation room with Darren and the rest of her team. She argued, negotiated, gave ground on things that didn't matter and held firm on things that did. She spent one full evening just listening to the Leo delegation describe what the last 20 years had been like for their species under council observation. The way their requests for assistance had been processed slowly, the way their technology had been reviewed and held, the way they had slowly stopped expecting things to improve. She did not try to respond to everything they said. She just listened. On the 19th day, the text of what would become the Holt Compact was put together in draft form. It was not a perfect document. Holt did not believe in perfect documents. She believed in honest ones. This one was honest. It established the council as a governing body of 12-7 original members plus humanity, plus the Ushan Reach, the Farron, the Leo, and a provision for future membership expansion by vote. It set the Bureau of Scientific Oversight on a 90-day mandatory response timeline with legal consequences for delay. It replaced the colonization freeze with a joint planning framework that gave all species equal input. It removed the resource tribute system entirely and replaced it with a voluntary mutual aid structure. And it included a single paragraph at the end that had taken 2 full days of arguing to agree on. A paragraph that said, in clear and simple language, that no species in the compact would be referred to, categorized, or treated as less than a full and equal member, in any document, in any session, in any context. Petitioning body, that language was gone. It was gone from every document, every framework, every form. It was a small thing, maybe, just words, but words were the shape that power took when it wanted to look permanent. The signing ceremony was not elaborate. There was no music, no grand speeches, no crowd. Each delegation's lead representative signed in alphabetical order by species name, using a simple electronic authentication that logged the time and date and sent copies to 12 different government archives simultaneously. When it was done, it was just done, a finished document, a new structure, a changed world. Afterward, in the common area, with the mixed atmosphere air circulating, and various beings drinking various things in various states of relief and exhaustion, Narration found her way to Holt's side. She was small enough that she had to look up to meet Holt's eyes, and she did so with the directness of someone who had stopped worrying about social convention roughly 50 years ago. "You could have made them afraid of you," she said. "The fleet, the encryption, the station in Varath, you had enough to make them very afraid." Holt looked around the room. The Ushan delegate was talking with one of the Farron representatives in quiet, quick sentences, and both of them had the look of people making plans. Darren was sitting on the floor in the corner going through his notes, which he would continue doing until someone told him to stop. The Leo delegation was clustered together near the viewport, looking out at the stars with an expression that Holt recognized. She had worn it herself, the first time she had looked at a sky that was not Earth's. "We had the tools for it," Holt said. "That's not the same as it being the right thing to do." She paused. "We've done the fear thing before back home with each other. It works for a while. It never builds anything that lasts." Narration considered that. 300,000 years of history, she said, and you retained that lesson. "We retained the scars," Holt said. "The lesson came with the scars." The elder nodded slowly, as if that answer had confirmed something she had suspected for a long time. Outside the viewport, the stars were the same as always. They did not know what had happened in this small plane room, on this small plane station, between 12 species working out a way to share a galaxy without crushing each other. They burned the same as they always had. But the people looking out at them were different than they had been 3 weeks ago. Something small and important had shifted. Something that had been closed had been opened, not by force, but by two things that were, when all was said and done, much harder to resist: patience and the simple refusal to accept a ceiling. It was, Holt thought, a decent start.